to technology as an environment even when technology is abstract, a procedure, an organization. It is far more of a mediation than an instrument. People generally conceive of technology as a means of action, allowing man to do what he was unable to achieve by his own means. That is true, of course. But it is much more important to consider that these means are a mediation between man and his natural environment. 17. This mediation can be either passive or active: clothing, dwellings, technological products, or screens placed between the body and the surrounding environment. Man has thus created a whole set of mediations all around himself. So long as technologies of traditional societies were sporadic and fragmentary, they represented singular mediations. The overall situation has changed with the multiplication of technologies and the development of the technological phenomenon. 18. Now, the character of that mediation is already that of the technological object. As Simondon emphasizes, concretization gives the technological object an intermediary place between the natural object and the scientific representation of the abstract, i.e., primitive technological object, which is a far cry from constituting a natural system. It is the translation into matter of a set of scientific notions and principles that are separate from one another. On the other hand, the concrete, i.e., evolved technological object approaches the existential mode of natural objects. It tends towards inner coherence, towards closure of the system of causes and effects. Furthermore, it incorporates a part of the natural world, which is involved as a condition of functioning. It has often been said that work is what makes the human being the mediator between nature and mankind as a species. If this is true, then technological work creates for itself the most immense set of mediations imaginable, because the work is incorporated and lasting. Through technological activity, man creates mediations, and these mediations can be detached from the individual who produces them and conceives them. The individual expresses himself in them but does not adhere to them. The machine has a kind of impersonalness, which allows it to become another man's instrument. The human reality that it crystallizes within itself is alienable precisely for being detachable. The technological object, conceived and constructed by man, is not limited to just creating a mediation between man and nature. It is a stable mixture of the human and the natural. It contains the human and the natural. It gives its human content a structure resembling that of natural objects. It can be inserted into the world of natural causes and effects in that human reality. The relation between man and nature is not merely experienced and practiced in an obscure fashion. It takes on a status of stability, of consistency, which makes it a reality having its own laws and its orderly permanence. Technological activity, by putting up the world of technological objects and universalizing the objective mediation between man and nature, reattaches man to nature with a far richer and more definite bond than that of the specific reaction of collective labor. Simondon. All those things are perfectly true, but we have to add that this mediation becomes exclusive of any other. There are no other relationships between man and nature. The whole set of complex and fragile bonds that man has patiently fashioned, poetic, magic, mythical, symbolic bonds, vanishes. There is only the technological mediation, which imposes itself and becomes total. Technology then forms both a continuous screen and a generalized mode of involvement. Technology is in itself not only a means, but a universe of means in the original sense of universum, both exclusive and total. The same is manifest in the relations between individuals or between individuals and the group. Here, too, everything becomes technological. Human relations can no longer be left to chance. They are no longer the object of experience, of tradition, of cultural codes, of symbolism. Everything has to be exposed: group dynamism, psychoanalysis, depth psychology, elucidated, then transformed into applicable technological schemata, pedagogy, human relations, etc. This is done in such a way that each individual adds his construction and also plays the exact role that is expected of him. Only then does he have full gratification for himself, and the others are gratified by his conforming behavior. The code has become technological. Baudrillard has marvelously described that in respect to communion. Speaking about televised sports, he shows that they have an important function: participation. The participating athlete and the participating spectator each gets what he wants. The athlete, the pleasure of being on the tube; the spectator, the feeling of being part of a whole in contact. They get what they're after: communion. Or rather, that modern, asepticized form of communion: communication, contact. What distinguishes the consumer society is not the deplored absence of ceremonies. The telecast game is as much of a ceremony as the Eucharist or as the sacrifice in primitive society. Now, however, the ceremonial communion does not go through bread and wine, which are flesh and blood. It goes through mass media, which are not only the messages, but also the broadcasting devices, the broadcasting network, the broadcasting station, the receiving apparatuses, and of course, the producers and the public. In other words, communion no longer passes through a symbolic support but through a technological support. It is in those terms that communion is communication. Baudrillard here puts his finger on the most profound mediating reality of technology. Technology is the support of interhuman communion. But this communion, no longer symbolic, has turned into sheer technological communication. In this way, and because man has entered a single, centralized, and exclusive model of mediation, technology has become a mediator. One can, of course, say that technology has always been that, and that it is only that by its very nature. As a means and an ensemble of means, it is obviously a mediator, an intermediary between man and his ancient environment. 19. This, however, has three vast consequences. The first is that we are dealing with an autonomous mediation. It is common knowledge that the most important thing is not so much the choice of a value as the possibility of a mediation between the value and the individual or the social body. Technology, as the sole mediator now recognized, actually escapes any system of values. Is there, then, no other mediator to make a choice for or against technology, to find the means of subjugating it? Man. Which man? The one who is already incorporated in the system. How about the state? But the state has already become technological. The people, the nation as a whole, according to the carefully nurtured myth that the people have to decide on the great options and technology has to carry them out. But the people are half a century behind the reality, and they understand nothing of the real problems that arise. At most, if the popular decisions were applicable, they could halt technological growth, interfere with the system, and provoke a socioeconomic regression, which the aforesaid people are in no way ready to accept. Thus, mediation by technology excludes any other, and this allows technology to entirely escape the desired or supposed values. No doubt, we have the impression that the intermediary of man, or of the masses, or of public opinion, is what brings about each development, each orientation of technology. But let us not forget that we are dealing with a man who is already within the system, and on whom the pressure is brought to bear. And this pressure is exerted not only by the existing reality, but also by the foreseeable and expected possibilities. Technologies now make it possible to shape desire, and public opinion forms on that basis. Yet, in its turn, public opinion exerts pressure in demanding the fulfillment of the desire. A small example: all experts are now unanimous that auto accidents are largely caused by speeding. 20. A very simple measure would appear possible. Car manufacturers might only install engines having limited power. If an engine could not go beyond 65 miles an hour, then a large number of the dangers and laws could be done away with. But no one seems to have envisioned this solution. Because as soon as it is possible to manufacture engines and cars that can do 120 miles on the highway, the technological possibility exerts a pressure of necessity on opinion. For modern man is situated in that environment. And public opinion, in turn, would not allow the manufacturers to curb the speed of their engines or prevent a possibility from coming true. One may therefore believe that the pressure of consensus is what mediates and controls. In reality, it plays that part only to the extent that it is preformed, adapted, and obedient to any technological possibility, but it has no more independence or specificity. The second consequence: the mediation by technology is essentially sterile and sterilizing, contrary to all previous systems of mediation, which were plurivocal, equivocal, unstable in their applications, and also deeply rooted in a rich and creative unconscious. Technology, on the other hand, is univocal, superficial but stable. It involves clear and orderly mediation, but without playing or evoking, without remembering or projecting. It is a truly efficient medium, and it has imposed itself in lieu of poetic mediations. It sterilizes all around itself anything that could disturb that rigor. It gives man a sterile universe with neither germs nor microbes. Finally, the third consequence: the relation between technology and man is non-mediated. The social or individual consciousness today is formed directly by the presence of technology, by man's immersion in that environment, without the mediation of thought, for which technology would only be an object, without the mediation of culture. The relation to technology is immediate, which does not mean that consciousness has now become the simple reflection of the technological environment. That is what, say, McLuhan means with his celebrated formula: the medium is the message. The message that man is trying to transmit has become the pure reflection of the technological system, of technological objects, of images and discourses which can only be technological images and discourses on technology. For the system permeates the totality of experience and social practice. 21. The focus on the technological object, a passive focus, attentive only to the functioning, interested only in the structure, fascinated by this spectacle without a backdrop, fully absorbed in its transparent substance, that focus becomes the prototype of the social act. Thus the mediating technological system becomes the universal mediator, excluding any other mediation but its own. 22. That is the highest degree of its autonomy. Mediatization by technology is fundamental to understanding modern society. Not only does technology mediate between man and the natural environment, and, to a second degree, between man and the technological environment, but it also mediates between men. People are more and more in contact with one another because of technological instruments, the telephone and psychological technologies, pedagogy, human relations, group dynamism. But also, each person enters into contact with humankind, the totality of men, through technological devices, TV, radio, etc., launching the reign of what has been dubbed long-term relations. These are qualitatively different from short-term relations, which are non-mediated or mediated by highly ineffective traditional cultural approaches. This technological mediatization of human relations produces a phenomenon that never stops amazing us: the growing sense of individual solitude in a world of universalized communications. Having become a universum of means and media, technology is in fact the environment of man. These mediations are so generalized, extended, multiplied that they have come to make up a new universe. We have witnessed the emergence of the technological environment. This means that man has stopped existing primarily in his natural environment, made up by what is vulgarly called nature, countryside, forests, mountains, ocean, etc. He now is situated in a new, artificial environment. He no longer lives in touch with the realities of the earth and the water, but with the realities of the instruments and objects forming the totality of his environment. 23. He is now in an environment made of asphalt, iron, cement, glass, plastic, and so on. Unless he is an aviator or sailor or on a mountain excursion during a period of leisure, he no longer has to know the signs of coming weather. Instead, he has an essential need to know the meanings of traffic signals. And even the problem of weather forecasting is no longer taken care of by a direct knowledge of the sky, the wind, etc., but by radio and TV weathermen. A person deals with the natural elements only through a set of technologies, which is so complete that he is actually dealing with those technologies themselves. The natural environment itself disappears. We obviously have to make a comparison with the city, an essential product of technology. In the city, man perceives the natural elements only accidentally: parks, sidewalk, trees. Nothing spontaneously natural is left here, and outside nature is reserved for spare time, relaxation, etc., given the decreasing importance of agriculture and the decline in the farming population. However, the substitution of the technological environment for the natural environment cannot be reduced to the phenomenon of urbanization. Work also produces the same rupture. The worker, for instance, no longer knows anything about the material he is working on. He only has to know the machines performing the necessary operations. And then soon, there is a second abstraction with automation. We can take all sectors of life and we will see the same trend everywhere. Children are brought up for this environment. A child does not have to know anything about the elements of nature. He has to know about factories and how to cross the street. He is technologically prepared to ply a trade in the technology. Technology is the living environment, not only because it excludes any direct relationship to the natural elements or modifies those that exist: water, air. Not only because man's environment is now made up solely of technological objects, but because technology infringes directly upon man's life, exacting adaptations like those once demanded by the natural environment. The world in which man lives is that of his mechanical environment. This brings both a knowledge of that environment and an overall behavior relative to that environment. Man no longer seeks to know the natural environment as such. And that is why the technological mind is radically different from the savage mind. The thinking process is most likely the same, but it applies to a different area, which necessarily results in a certain mode. The mode of savage thinking was in accord and in harmony with the natural environment. When man finds himself in an environment that is becoming exclusively technological, the mode of savage thinking, which survives as such in man, becomes fairly useless. The savage mind is determined by the natural environment. Its application point is the natural environment. It shapes that environment by establishing the relationship between the human environment and the natural environment. However, it is the natural environment that serves not only as an environment, but even more so as an interpreter for the relationship of man to himself and of men to one another. Substituting the technological environment for the natural environment produces a change in those relationships. A schism occurs among men, a splintering of natural groups, formal communication replaces communion, and the technological environment then serves as interpreter for the false relationships of men. For if we admit, and I willingly do so, that the savage mind is a constitutive part of human nature, then the fact that it exists in an inadequate environment commits men not to community, but to all kinds of schisms. This is particularly obvious in the difficulty or impossibility of symbolizing. One of modern man's greatest losses is the faculty of symbolizing. This faculty did and could function only in relation to the natural environment. Symbolization, which helped man to survive in a hostile world, has become inadequate for the technological environment, in which it has no use. Modern man is torn apart. Symbolization remains so profoundly inscribed in him after millennia that it cannot be annulled. But all in all, it has been rendered gratuitous, ineffective. It is even blocked because the environment of man today is utterly unsusceptible to the necessity of that process. The results are escape symbolization, as in modern art, artificial symbolization bearing upon technology but perfectly useless and meaningless, as we shall see later on. The approach to the grasp, interpretation, and control of the technological environment cannot take place through symbolization. As for the natural environment, symbolization is made perfectly meaningless here by the dominance of utilitarian technology. Our knowledge concerns an abstraction of the natural environment, which is grasped through finer and finer technologies. But the living environment is the mechanical and technological environment, which is studied directly as such. We would, for instance, be therefore dealing with the theory of vibrations and shocks as a total explanation for the living environment. This kind of study concerns not only a mechanical resource that the engineer has to utilize in his work, but the whole of the human environment. And there is no way of thus analyzing the human environment than by starting with the technological environment. Mechanics in itself constitutes an environment, and it in turn is merely a tiny part of the technological environment. Man now has to study his surroundings exactly as primitive man had to study his natural surroundings. First of all, in order to survive in them, and then in order to try and master them and get as much out of them as possible. When we are dealing with an environment that is intermediary between the natural and the technological environment, namely the urban milieu, we have only one thought in mind: to transfer it into a purely technological environment. The urban milieu preserves a few aspects of the natural environment: a certain spontaneity, an incoherence in regard to man, a luxuriance, a diversity and irrationality. Like the natural surroundings, the urban environment is both close and alien to man. Formed uniquely out of technological products, it is, nevertheless, not the technological environment per se, because its development was anarchic and not technological. Yet that is exactly what makes us so ill at ease. It does not have the rigor, the simplicity, the rationality of technologies. Man has introduced his disorder here. He has turned these surroundings into his own thing. The streets are dirty and crowded. There are mysterious nooks. There is wasted space. The lines are not clean and nothing is functional. This is not just the conflict between medieval towns and automobile traffic. It is, far more deeply, the product of traditional technologies, a product that man has humanized, and that fails to satisfy our impetuous desire for subjecting everything to exact technologies. The Swedes have managed to do so. By dint of rigorous planning and an efficient system of public transport, they have succeeded in renovating the center of Stockholm and creating new suburban towns out of nothing. They have achieved a near-perfect technization of the urban texture, and thus, of course, they have produced an agreeable milieu. Not only is the technological rationality satisfied, but the latter can also be agreeable if correctly employed. We now realize that people need so and so many places of relaxation, so and so many square yards of green space, so and so many socio-cultural appurtenances, etc., and yet Stockholm is tinged with a certain anxiety, as though people were wondering what is to come once this perfection is attained. And then what? What is there beyond paradise? Urbanism remains a problem even when everything has been worked out. Is this man's eternal dissatisfaction, or the difficulty that a still primitive man has in adjusting to an environment that is utterly technicized, though agreeable? We cannot answer this question today. Nevertheless, it is true that now, as modern men, we are called upon not to employ technologies, but to hew with and among them. Rorvik can, assuredly, describe the idyllic marriage of man and robot. But the problem is more subtle. Our adaptations to natural realities, going back to remote ages, have now become useless. What good is knowing how to tell a mushroom from a toadstool or how to steal up to a deer? We have to adjust to a new set of realities. We have to train new reflexes, learn technologies for using the brain, for appreciating art, itself an expression of the technological society, for establishing human relations through the intermediary of technologies. The technological environment is no longer a set of resources that we sometimes use for work or distraction. It is now a coherent ensemble which corsets us on all sides, which encroaches upon us, and which we can no longer do without. It is now our one and only living environment. Nonetheless, we have to avoid a misunderstanding. People habitually speak of an artificial environment made up of objects. For several years now, they have belabored the point of the invasion of the objects. George's par excellence choses is significant. We live in an object universe, and Baudrillard has even made a system of these objects. That universal presence, that need to make up for that existential fault by owning a lot of things, that process leading to the reification of man, which I myself have studied, all those things certainly exist. But we have also noticed that these objects are not lasting and are made to be thrown away. These objects do not exist by themselves. They replace one another in rapid succession. They are totally valueless. They have an obvious momentary luster when acquired. Then they stop being truly useful, pleasant, familiar. They are no longer our companions. They are really made in full use to be destroyed and cast away. The invasion by the objects is accompanied by the scorn for those very same objects. These two facts must be viewed together. There is not a proliferation on one side and on the other side an appended remark, the replacement. In point of fact, things are made to be destroyed, bought to be discarded, multiplied in order to be eliminated. Objects are the object of our profound scorn. But why is that? In reality, these objects have no value or importance whatsoever. They exist only as products of the technological mechanism. What characterizes this society is not the object but the means. It is not the invasion by the objects, but the multiplication of means ad infinitum. Modern art bears fine witness to that structural reality. This is profoundly corroborated by the fact that it ultimately makes no difference what technology bears upon, because technology allows anything to be done. And if there is a proliferation of objects, it is not a phenomenon in itself, nor a response to a human desire, but rather it is the direct effect of applying technological means. Only the means are glorified. Products are not valued very highly. We need only consider the communist goal. An equal sharing of products and incomes is not at all satisfying. The real point is to control the instruments of production. The stakes are not greater consumer power but ownership of the technology. Of course, the Leninists are ignorant of any correct analysis of the technological society, and in formulating their demand, they do not realize what they are doing, but they are spontaneously obeying the scale of real values. And if we regard objects as the reality surrounding us, then we have to watch out for the more and more widely stated belief that the object ultimately does not exist, any more than the subject. The sharp traditional distinction is vanishing. For the sake of what? Processes of involvement, structures of functioning. We will have to show elsewhere that structuralism is not a creative way of thinking, but the simple product of the primacy of the means. How it works. But this is exclusively technology. This is the universe dominated by technologism. However, there is one very interesting thing about this philosophical trend. It reveals that, in order to give elbow room and free play to the superordinated activity of the technological means, the subject must not exist. The subject must only obey the means. However, the object must not exist either. The object is merely an unimportant product of the workings of the technologies, which is exactly what that philosophy states. We thus reach the decisive conclusion that our universe is not a universe of objects, that it is not a system of objects, but a universe of means and a technological system. The fact that the technological environment has become our living environment obviously entails a certain number of modifications in the traditional environments within which human history has unfolded. Let us use the schematic terms, nature and society. Nature, now technicized, and society, now technological, are no longer what they have always been. In fact, this change may be viewed as the final question of our study. But at the outset, we have to take a few quick looks. It is probably unnecessary to stress the action of modern technology on the natural surroundings, on that nature which is itself a product of human work, albeit with soft technologies and without involving an endless control. We need merely point out the admirable studies by B. Charbonneau in particular, Le Jardin de Babylone, Tristes Campagnes. More abstractly, however, We have to understand that the new environment acts by penetrating and bursting the older ones. The old natural environment is not really abandoned in favor of the new technological one. Rather, the new one permeates the old one, engulfs it, utilizes it, but in order to become the phagocyte and disintegrates it, like a cancerous tissue proliferating in an earlier non-cancerous one. The simplest visual example is the way the city world encroaches upon rural areas through the spread of the suburbs. The technological environment could not exist if it did not find its support and resources in the natural world, nature and society. But it eliminates the natural as a milieu, supplanting it while wasting and exhausting it. Technology can become an environment only if the old environment stops being one, but that implies destructuring it as an environment and exploiting it to such an extreme that nothing is left of it. In other words, the well-known depletion of natural resources, which we shall come back to later, results not only from abuse by the technologies, but also from the very establishment of technology as man's new milieu. Technology acts upon these environments first by dividing and fragmenting the natural and cultural realities. The process of technological encroachment upon reality always consists in breaking up reality into malleable fragmentary units. This breakup corresponds to the scientific discovery of discontinuity. Scientists have discovered separable units, atoms, particles, phonemes, chromosomes, in the heart of temporality. This investigation of the discontinuous is reaching through all areas. Things that change, things that seem to come into being, are defined by an arrangement of elementary units. 24. This analysis reduces all motion to elements and a motionless whole. Machines operate on those givens. But science's reduction of reality to discontinuity is transposed by technology. Reality is broken up into elements that are actually, and not theoretically, separated. Thus, each element can be used by itself. It can be rearranged and recombined. It can be quantified and classified in any way. But here we are dealing with both a new system technological and the concrete reality in which man is forced to live. Technology reduces a whole to simple units by analyzing it and generally compartmentalizing it. The Taylor work method is a model example. Craftsmanship was once a complex ensemble of undivided gestures and operations. It expressed the laboring individual, and it produced a complete whole, a work. The division of labor and then tailorization brought greater efficiency and interchangeability, but at the price of splintering and dividing work into perfect and indivisible gestural units. The work gesture was totally separated from the worker's person and existed on its own. This led to fragmenting the primary datum in all domains. Next, technology took up these utterly simplified elements in order to reconstitute a new whole, a new synthesis, integrating the natural factors, which were previously disintegrated. But this technological whole is not at all gratifying for man, perhaps because he remains traditional. Man still feels as if he were living in a splintered universe, a splintered society, even though it is more thoroughly unified than ever, a splintered, incoherent life. The wholes established by technology do not make us feel complete or satisfied. They are still experienced as splintered wholes. Here and there, man recognizes and greets a fragment of his former universe, integrated in a functional but alien and anonymous whole in which he nevertheless must live. There is no other. Against that feeling of splintering, modern man feels a keen desire for all-inclusiveness, for synthesis. But alas, any synthesis produced by anything but technology fails and comes to naught. There is no possible archi-acute, nor any return to earth. Man is dissatisfied for being man, and this dissatisfaction which we know up to this point cannot be avoided. For in regard to all the environments that technology invades, and it now invades all of them, it is inevitably simplifying, reductive, operational, instrumental, and rearranging. It reduces all that was natural to the fragment of a manageable object, and anything that cannot be thus managed, manipulated, utilized, is rejected and discarded as worthless. On the huge debit side of possibilities, value is placed only on things that can be utilized. Anything else, which for the moment is not yet the object of technology, is abandoned to contingency and chance in a technological society. We thus have the double aspect of simplification and reduction of all reality by all technology. On the one hand, we have a rigorous system that performs without fail. On the other hand, a terrain that we consider unknown, absurd, having destroyed in advance the values that were able to give meaning to freedom. Thus, in the complex tissue of social and human reality, technology cuts out what can constitute an environment, but neutralizes and designifies anything it does not keep. However, since the technological system is essentially dynamic, far more so than the ecosystem, technology tends blindly to replace the totality of what formed the natural ecosystem. Technology keeps conquering more and more, assimilating and reorganizing endlessly. Ultimately, the ideal for this new environment is to exist to such a degree that nothing else exists. Such, basically, is the dream of authors like Rorvik. But there's a rub. The old environment has not totally disappeared. We still have air and water, and even man cannot do without them as yet. This is essentially what causes the irrationality and the system crisis as we see it. For the moment, let us remember that there has been a decisive reversal. Man once lived in a natural environment, using technical instruments to get along better in it, protect himself against it, and make use of it. Now, man lives in a technological environment, and the old natural world supplies only his space and his raw materials. Ultimately, the technological environment thus presumes to replace all of the natural environment, performing all of its functions. But obviously, we will never reach the old complexity of the natural environment, a complexity that we discover more and more as we destroy it. We cannot reach it because technology simplifies. We still have to ask whether that complexity was necessary to human life. We will study this topic later. But there is no imitation, no reproduction of that natural environment. There is only a creation of a new environment, even though in many cases we are forced to replace natural mechanisms, which turn out to be indispensable. Thus we keep introducing more and more exterior regulations. One of the fundamental laws of ecology is that we can achieve stability through ever-growing complexity, a complexity of modifications and exchanges in the environment, which allow a diversified adaptation. When we replace a complex natural mechanism with a simple technological mechanism, we make the ecosystem more vulnerable and less adaptable. Now this solution by the technological environment, simultaneously the condition for its expansion, applies to both the natural and the social environment. In the social milieu, the complex mediations of a traditional society are replaced by the rationalized and simplified relations of a bureaucracy, in the technological and positive sense of the word. This environment thus has features linked to the efficiency of technology. But they are dangerous, at least to the extent that we do not exactly know the complexities of the ecosystem, reduced to a supporting role that we are destroying. We discover them by the consequences of their disappearance. Needless to say, this environment is totally artificial, which is not a criticism. The natural does not have an eminent and normative value for me. Each factor in this environment results not from the combative creation of a living whole, but from an addition of processes that can be isolated and combined as artificially as they were created ex post facto. Each factor can be examined, measured, isolated from the rest because we establish the connection, and we can test the result. The technological environment is in fact characterized by the growth of abstraction and controls. It is obvious that in such conditions, the technological environment scarcely favors spontaneity, creativity, nor can it know living rhythms, which are obviously tied to the natural environment. 25. We will come upon this question again. The artificiality means essentially that only artifacts can enter this environment, and that man can relate only to them. Anything else cannot be part of the environment. It would not harmonize. which is perfectly intolerable in the technological environment. There is no way to picture a car engine with a little grass or some flowers. Such additions may be a charming fantasy, of course, but they are incongruous. Without claiming that the technological environment is equivalent to an engine, the comparison is a good one. Only the artifact can enter this environment, for it is made in such a way as to fit in exactly. It is made for, which cannot be said of any of the natural elements. Hence, the artificialness of the technological environment causes it to be absolutely exclusive. And this is also translated into the economic and social forms. Observers, for instance, emphasize that statics have disappeared and been replaced by dynamics. Some, like J. Leclerc, La Révolution de l'Homme au XXe siècle, even dwell quite triumphantly on this fact. Property, capital, is losing its importance to know-how. Raw material is becoming secondary to the product. The stress must be placed on action and not on passivity. Just as man's isolation, triggering stagnation, has given way to the worldwide relationship, socialness, community, public services. In reality, all these things, which are accurately pointed out, are the visible social signs of a passage from a natural to a technological environment. It used to be nature that imposed its evolutionary rhythm upon us. Now it is technology. It used to be nature that determined certain social structures, Baudin's and Montesquieu's famous theory of climates. Now it is technology. It used to be nature that meted out the raw materials. Now the crux is the technological processing. It used to be nature that required man to establish fixed laws of relations between objects and himself, property. Now, the objects, emerging from a constantly renewing technological action, are no longer so important. What counts is know-how, which enables us to fit in precisely and find our places in the technological environment. This technological environment forces us to consider everything a technological problem, and at the same time to lock ourselves up in, enclose ourselves in, an environment that has become a system. Let us take the first aspect. We now have a certain frame of mind, a certain way of looking at situations. We automatically regard every issue, every situation in terms of some technology. We are disabled when we have no technology to deal with some administrative or psychological matter. We have to reduce a situation to technological terms so that it truly becomes a technological problem. A typical though anecdotal example. Madame P. Sarton writes an article in Le Monde, April 1973. Woman's status in our society, a technological problem. The contents of the article do not matter. It is the title that is highly significant in linking the two concepts, status and technology. A person's status in society, a complex, ambiguous problem tied to infinite variables, is suddenly boiled down to a technological problem. Study the problems of the woman's condition with some technicians, modify a few factors, and you will change her status. That is to say, both the opinion about women and their opinion about themselves, the experienced social hierarchy, the metaphysics of love and of the complementary opposition of the sexes, etc. No, it's all a dream. There are indeed a few technological issues in that question. The woman's dilemma of home versus a job, the use of psychological knowledge, and so on. And yet the woman's status is not a technological one. But Madame Sarton is typical in being convinced that it is. I could cite 100 analogous examples showing to what degree we think we are living in a technological environment. On the other hand, it is quite true that the more technological factors we get involved with, in fact, the more the problems raised are really technological problems. There is thus an actual growth of technological problems, which makes us infer that all problems are technological. The further we advance, the more vulnerable we become. We depend more and more on systems. The natural mechanisms tend to get out of order and have to be replaced by technological mechanisms. Hitherto, any difficulties were of a natural order, but with the mechanism of replacement, they become technological. When we can no longer have drinking water furnished by nature, Our water supply will depend on factories that purify polluted water or desalt ocean water. Under such conditions, a water shortage will be due not to a climatic drought, but to a breakdown at a plant. We can generalize this example. The technological environment makes problems and difficulties technological, though not all so far. Finally, there is a trend toward a genuine enclosure in this environment, and this strikes me as particularly important in language. Linguistic studies, and not just structuralism, tend more and more to reduce human language to a certain number of structures, functions, and mechanisms, giving us the impression that we now understand this strange and mysterious phenomenon better than before. But what modern linguistics really does is to reduce language in such a way as to make it fit neatly into this technological universe, trimmed down to an indispensable communication for the creation of the system. Language is losing its mystery, its magic, its incomprehensibility. It no longer expresses dreams. Or rather, by being technologically deciphered, language becomes a way of bringing dreams, inspirations, aspirations, and ecstasies into the technological environment. Today, it is out of place to make fun of the many hermetic jargons emerging everywhere. This use of bizarre words perfect a praxeological approach, optimalize decisions, explore qualitative fields of action, parameterize future possibilities, etc., is a desperate effort to grasp the new technological reality by means of language. It is intellectual hypocrisy to mock an attempt at fitting language to this environment. But this striving is innocent. The true aggression is the technization of language, for at this moment everything is locked up in the technological environment. When speech is a serf, everything is a serf. Language is the ultimate outlet, the ultimate questioning, even if it is reduced to a shriek. But the it and the one who are speaking tell us that the technological lid has clamped down and that this universe is closed. Our modern linguists are heatedly working toward that end. At this point, we ought to go into Tzvetan and Todorov theories of the symbol, 1977. According to Todorov, the Romantic crisis was a total upheaval. The classical conception of identity, of the unity of the world and language, involved an imitative behavior mimesis. This was followed by the image of a diversity, an uncertainty, melodrama instead of tragedy, illuminating the difference, with the whole thing resting on the concept of production. How can we fail to see the aesthetic, spiritual, and image-fraught expression here of the passage to technology and to the indefiniteness of technological production?